Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show from the Palace of Westminster, where we return our focus this week to UK politics and examine the implications of the radically different electoral trends of all four of the UK's component nations. Earlier this month, elections took place across England for local government and for the devolved nations of Scotland and Wales. This was the biggest electoral test of this Parliament. And although Northern Ireland had no elections, changes are underway nonetheless in the turbulent province. In England, the Tories triumphed, but in Wales, Labour secured their best result since the dawn of the Welsh Synod in 1999. However, in Scotland, both Labour and Tories failed to dent the supremacy of the SNP, who are left only one seat short of an overall majority in a proportional parliament. Over the next 2 weeks, we ask four independent-minded parliamentarians to explain the divergent political trends in the four countries of the UK and to predict what it might mean for the future of the Union itself. Today, we speak to unaligned peer Baroness Fox of Buckley and rebel Scottish Nationalist MP Angus MacNeil about the old enemies Scotland and England. Are their political paths destined for divergence? But first, your tweets, messages and emails in response to our show last week on COVID and whether it is indeed ever with us. Bob says, every time they say it's over, there's another spike and we are back to lockdown. Mandatory masks is the only way you're going to stop this, along with vaccinations. Eileen says, it's inevitable the virus will spread with easing of lockdown, hence why taking the vaccine is imperative to lessen serious illness. Debbie says, I had all the symptoms of COVID over Christmas and New Year 2019-2020 and have had bouts of exhaustion over the past year. Pretty sure I had COVID and now have long COVID. William says, as usual, brilliant show. Can I say it's a well-known fact that travel by plane and you're sure to catch even the common cold. Just for that reason, no one should be travelling, let alone going on holiday. Is it so much hardship to just stay close to home? Sandra says, we should have shut down like Australia and New Zealand. Anita says, close the doors to every country. Patricia says, nature is very clever. If it's not winning, it will adapt to make sure it does. Now over to Alex and Baroness Claire Fox.
Claire Fox, relatively newcomer to the House of Lords, but you've been around politics a fair amount. Did the scale of Labour's defeat in the English local elections surprise you?
The scale of it did surprise me. I love the electorate. They're always stroppy. They go beyond anything you anticipate. But what I wasn't surprised about was a confirmation that the move away from Labour is well and truly embedded now. And that once people broke from Labour, particularly in relation to the last general election, but before that, I think even in the European elections, when a lot of them voted for the Brexit Party, you could see that people were just saying, I've had enough.
So is this a Brexit phenomenon? Is this a replacement of class politics, traditional loyalties with identity politics, or are other factors at work?
I think that when we say it's influenced by Brexit, I don't mean that everything is Brexit. I think, however, people felt betrayed by the Labour Party over Brexit. That particular working class base felt that they had been treated with contempt by the Labour Party, called xenophobes, racist, that they didn't know what they were doing by the Labour Party, and that cemented a sort of rupture that, probably had been under the surface for a while because the Labour Party had long moved away from its base. But there was a kind of, what can we do about it? And then Brexit it opened that up. I think what's happened, though, is that through the Brexit years, as it were, post the referendum, people have looked at the Labour Party long and hard, and they've been able to have the confidence to say, you don't care about us, you don't represent us, you've moved away from our interests, you're much more interested in identity politics, you are becoming like a metropolitan elite party, you think that our values are backward, you don't take any notice of us and you take us for granted. And therefore, the local elections, I think, gave people an opportunity to vote again, saying, we've had enough.
So this is big trouble for Sir Keir Starmer. And it's a bit of an irony, isn't it? But you might argue that Labour have moved away from Corbynism to Stammerism, if there's such a thing, just at the time where Corbyn's brand of politics might have worked better.
Well, the irony is, I think, that Corbynism did have a base. I might not have agreed with it. I might have thought its base was limited, but gave a certain enthusiasm to a particular group of people around, you know, what passes for left-wing politics. I mean, I'd be very critical of it. I think a lot of it was anodyne and superficial. But I understood it enthused people. You know, he did have big rallies, that's true. Keir Starmer, what does he offer? You know, he supported the Corbyn project, but was a bit lacklustre. He was very much associated with the Remain camp, which, as I say, is not going to play well. And then he comes in and it's not clear what he stands for other than not being Corbyn. They could have found a way of being a different party, but they didn't. And I think it's gone. That's the main thing I'm saying is, if Labour is finished in Scotland, and I think that the lesson is that Labour, when I used to have mates in Scotland, spend every summer there, the Labour Party were the dominant party. I could never imagine in those days that there would anything other than Labour domination. And now look at them, and I think that the lesson is that once that slippery slope starts in quite as dramatic a way, then I can't see how they can recover.
Well, let's look at the other nations of the United Kingdom. I mean, you're a flint lass yourself, but is Wales not a bit of a paradox? I mean, Wales was as Brexit inclined as England, and yet Labour emerged triumphant in Wales.
And I'm prepared to say that I don't entirely understand that, because everybody I know in Wales is actually fed up with Labour. But it's one thing that we have to take into account, and this is why the electorate isn't owned by anyone and they'll do what they want, is that Mark Drakeford, who I don't think people took particularly seriously as the First Minister in Wales, but since the pandemic started, he's been on the television every single day. And there has been a sense of paternalistic regard. You know, there's a kind of like, he's looked after us, he's got us the vaccines. I mean, there's a huge amount of criticism that one could make of the handling of the pandemic in Wales, but so there is in Scotland and so there is in England, right? But I do think the elections happened at the end, where there was light at the end of the tunnel, where people could think, you got us through this. You know, we didn't all die, and we're kind of going to see the end of this. So I think there was a certain gratitude. He benefited from incumbency in that regard. Labour can't survive on a Welsh Labour vote, though. That's absolutely certain.
Now, let's talk about Scotland. I mean, your observation from the benches in the Lords. I mean, how do you think the Tory government's going to deal with Scotland? Well, what's the cunning scheme has Boris Johnson got in his back pocket to put down the pesky Scots?
Well, bear in mind that I'm a unionist, and so you and I won't agree on this question. I think that one of the things that's interesting is how defensive the government are, actually how defensive the Labour Party are, on the question of Scottish nationalism in particular. As it happens, you can see it a little bit in relation to the Northern Irish question as well. And I think there is a democratic dilemma. It's a democratic dilemma for me. I mean, you have to rule by consent. I, however, think that what will happen is that they simply won't afford a referendum. They just won't give one. And there is a problem for the Scottish Nationalist Party, it seems to me, or, you know, the Scottish Nationalist cause, which is that Nicola Sturgeon made it very clear in this election that if you voted for her, you were not voting for a referendum. She made that clear. You were voting for the record of the government in relation to how she'd run the country, right? And if you want, the incumbency question then matters.
Well,
so,
I think, Nicola, let's be fair to Ms Sturgeon, that I think what she argued was they weren't voting for a referendum immediately, but voting for one after the pandemic was over.
Well, that was not, I mean, I certainly know, well, let's put it this way. I know lots of people in Scotland who voted SNP. They have broken with Labour. They were never going to vote Tory. They voted SNP because they thought she did a good job with the pandemic. They were therefore endorsing the SNP. They're not particularly Scottish nationalists. In other words, they were taking that as a kind of, maybe down the line. That's a fair point. That's a fair point for you to make. The reason I'm saying that is because I think that it's ambivalent about whether the demand for a referendum was contained in that vote. And it's a little bit like, do we take that the Tories have just done brilliantly in the election to mean that everybody thinks that Boris Johnson and the Tories are absolutely the most brilliant people to run the country, the United Kingdom? And I think it's more complicated than that.
David Cameron got a Brexit referendum on what, 40% of the vote when he won the election?
He made a decision to do that. I mean, I was as surprised as anyone, right? He didn't need to have made that decision, did he? I mean, I actually thought there should be a referendum on the constitutional question of the relationship with the European Union, but I didn't expect him to give one. But he was panicking because there were people kind of chomping at his ankles. So despite the fact that that referendum was set up to establish once and for all that a pro-EU but slightly Eurosceptic Tory party was the way forward and none of this absolutely Eurosceptic nonsense was going to win, he lost.
Now, Claire Fox, I'm dying to ask you this. I mean, you're by no means the first radical politician to grace the House of Lords, but you might be the first revolutionary communist in your original political ideas to be in the Lords' benches. How are you finding it so far?
It's certainly not a lifestyle I'm accustomed to, and I'm as surprised as anyone that I'm there. You know, the Revolutionary Communist Party ended in, over 20 years ago, 25 years ago or whatever, so it's been a while. But you are right that I'm not the usual character. How am I finding it? Actually, on a positive note, I am very impressed by the degree of erudition and some of the people in there who, in terms of holding legislation to scrutiny and understanding legislation, are very impressive. I've also found it even more anti-democratic than I thought it would be, because it's got a much more influence over the government, particularly because the government has such a large majority. Things sail through the Commons, which means that the real job of amending laws happens in the House of Lords, and they are unelected. I am unelected, and therefore I think that they are more influential in terms of the outcome of legislation than I would want. In terms of the atmosphere, well, we're in a pandemic, so it's not exactly full, but I just cannot get used to people calling me Baroness, and I cannot get used to the fact that there are earls and people with hereditary titles, and the building is beautiful. I grew up being obsessed with history. I loved old castles, going to museums. I always wanted to live in a Jane Austen novel and own a manor. And now I go in and they call me lady every day, and I get to see these beautiful pictures. I'm still kind of appreciating it like I'm walking around a museum at this stage.
So, Claire Fox, an instrumental role in the Brexit referendum, now in the House of Lords. I think the Labour Party is in a very poor position, lost connection with its traditional electorate. Is it going to be a case of the Tories ascendant, or are we going to see new trends emerging in politics? What's your view? I
think that the Tory party are now completely schizophrenic in as much as they've almost got two parties in there. I've been very surprised by, in the House of Lords, how, I hate this expression but I'm going to use it as shorthand, how woke so many of the Tories are. They've adopted a lot of the identity politics, a lot of the environmentalist politics that are the flavour of the day. They sound as though they're, they brought in a maternity bill recently, which was a very good bill for ministers to have maternity leave, and they refused to have the word woman in it. It required a rebellion in the Lords, would you believe, to get them to have the word mother in it. And that was a compromise because they still wouldn't have the word woman. And this was Tory ministers, right? Tory front benches. So you will know that the whole issue of gender critical feminism, which is wreaking havoc in Scotland as much as anywhere, is very much in the House of Lords and in the Tory party. That's the point I'm making. So I think that we are seeing a new trend, which is the Tory party will almost represent everything but can't hold it together at some point. I also think the electorate are not done. I think the electorate have had the stuffing knocked out of them, as we all have, every citizen has, because of the pandemic. We've been atomised, demobilised. Basically, the public square has been closed down for the last over a year. Democracy was suspended. So I think we're yet to see whether the kind of what's described as the populist moment, but certainly a declaration by the electorate that they wanted to take back control, they wanted a new kind of politics, which demonstrates itself, I think, around the Brexit vote, but not only that. I think we'll see more of that to come. I just don't know what shape it will take yet.
Baroness Fox, Claire Fox, thank you so much for joining me on the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you.
Join us after the break where Alex speaks to the MP for Nahealing and Near, Angus MacNeil. We'll see you then. Welcome back to the show. Alex is now joined by SNP MP Angus MacNeil.
Now, Angus MacNeil, looking at things from your northern fastness of Nahiwn and Year, how do you survey these divergent election results in the 4 countries of the UK?
Well, I think that the headline for anybody who supports independence is that the independent supporting parties have a majority in the Scots Parliament. The secondary thing I'd like to highlight, and it's very obvious as well, is that this really was an incumbents election, more or less. The SNP and Greens did well in Scotland. Labour did well, as they were the party in power in Wales. And almost inexplicably, Boris Johnson and the Tories did well in England. But of course, they were the party of power in England. So it's been an incumbents election in Scotland, England and Wales.
Well, let's look at that first. I mean, presumably that's the electorate rewarding people, the leaders, the First Ministers, the Prime Minister, for taking them through the pandemic. But if you observe the record of the pandemic, as indeed has been said this week by Dominic Cummings, no less, in front of a House of Commons committee, the record in all 3 countries is pretty indifferent in international terms.
I mean, I don't know if the record matters as much. If we cast our minds back to the 1970s, governments everywhere were losing power in the oil shock. It didn't really matter what they did or if they were responsible for it or not, they were losing power. I think this is the reverse of an oil shock that we see at the moment. It's people are scared, people are nervous, and people don't want to change anything that they know and are familiar with. There's enough change going on, so they cleave to the governments they've had in Wales, they've cleaved to what they've had in Scotland, and they've cleaved to what they've had in England as well. And I think rather than records, it's even deeper in the human psyche than analysing. It's one of fear, and when people are fearful, they've just cast for the status quo in each place.
And will that be long-lasting? I mean, you're saying that governments are rewarded despite tens of thousands of unnecessary deaths in care homes because of the delay in lockdown, because of the scandal over protective equipment. You're saying none of that matters? Is that going to continue to be ignored by the electorate?
I think what will happen is the natural shift that would happen in politics anyway has been stopped at this moment. But I think the shift is on, and it's almost a corkscrew effect and a spring effect, perhaps better. And it'll spring differently once this pressure is gone, and which way that'll manifest itself is kind of not easy to see at the moment, or easy to detect, but there will be a shift in quite what people think when the fear goes and they start to analyse more. What that will manifest itself as is a big question, and it's not one I've got ready answers for.
Well, let's turn to the Scottish results first. From someone of your inclination, and mine for that matter, who wants further, faster progress on the constitutional question, surely your view's been refuted by the election. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon's cautious approach to the constitutional question has been totally vindicated.
Well, you can argue these in many ways, but the argument I would say is that had we put the constitutional question to the people in May, we'd have won. People think that Scottish independence is something that...
Sorry, how do you mean put the constitutional question to the people in May? How is that possible?
Had we told them that the election was for independence, we would have had a mandate for independence. The parties of independence, the SNP, the Greens and the Alapa Party, together even with Andy Whiteman, but even without him, had the majority of votes in the list, and clearly they won the first past the post. So not any measure of this election, it was won by the pro-independence parties. So if we'd asked the question, we would have delivered independence. There's a school of thought in the SNP that they don't want to lose a referendum, so the way that they go around achieving that is by not holding the referendum. Now, if you don't hold it, you can't lose it. But you know, my counter argument is, for as long as we leave Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak in charge, we're losing each and every day. Whereas for as long as Priti Patel is sending Home Office snatch squads into the south side of Glasgow to take people from Kenmure Street, a chef and a motor mechanic, we're losing that day as well. So the longer we leave this, the more we lose. We could have asked the question and we probably could have won the question, but if we don't ask the question, we're never going to lose. But actually, we are losing.
So in your estimation, what's going on in Downing? So what's happening in the Downing Street bunker at the present moment? Is Boris Johnson waiting for a major challenge from the north once he gets rid of this pandemic inquiry and Dominic Cummings' criticisms? Is he preparing for a major challenge from the Scottish National Party?
Well, I can bring you some exclusive gossip from Tory circles that I've picked up in my sojourn to Westminster, the first in just about a year, is that they're quite surprised of the silence from north of the border. They're wondering what we're playing at. They expected they were going to have a very busy May. The Cabinet Office has been beefed up, Downing Street's ready to refute all sorts of stuff, but there's nothing coming from Scotland. Now, it could be a very clever double bluff. Hopefully it is. But there's a danger of losing the momentum on independence as well. Hopefully that won't last very long, and by the time the health effects of the pandemic are done, and remember the Scottish Government controls that independently, when the economic effects need to be dealt with, that we get the independence to do that. Because Norway and Ireland are going to prove that you need the independence to deal with the recovery from this pandemic and not leave it to the economic extremists that are Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak.
But isn't Nicola Sturgeon right that the people would, generally speaking, want a government to deal with the pandemic first and then move on to other issues such as the constitution or whatever fascinates them, as opposed to apparently subordinating recovery from the pandemic to some constitutional ambition?
I mean, of course, Nicola Sturgeon is right. As my party political leader, I'm bound to say that, of course. But, you know, I think we can walk and chew gum. We need to use our left foot and our right foot. We need to recover from the pandemic, but also be prepared to do that on our terms and not Westminster terms. And if we leave it too long, we will be recovering from the pandemic, or we'll be limping through the pandemic recovery on the terms of Rishi Sunak and the austerity that the Tories always cleave to when they run out of ideas. And we know that they don't have much clue at the best of times, so this is going to be damaging to Scotland. We won't see the recovery that Norway and Ireland will have. Different places we will have different policies, but they will be tailored for Norway and tailored for Ireland. We won't see this in Scotland because we'll be stuck with Westminster behind me, shaping Scotland's future. So we have to do exactly what Nicola Sturgeon is doing and get the pandemic part sorted out, the health part of the pandemic, but we've also got to separate out the economic part of the pandemic. And that surely is something that Scotland can do best. We can't argue for independence and then say that we don't need it until Westminster sorts out our recovery. We need independence for the recovery, is surely what we should be arguing for. And I think that is generally what we're arguing for. It just is a question of emphasis.
Well, looking at England and Wales and your view from the Outer Hebrides, looking down at the other nations of the UK, are they, if Labour finished totally in England, I mean, are they bust beyond repair now?
It doesn't look great for Labour in England at all, and I've got to say the morale when I speak to English Labour MPs, well, there's just about our only English Labour MPs left, it's not great at all. They're not expecting any major change of fortunes. They're hoping to hold on to what they have, which is a pretty disastrous situation from the gift of the 2019 election, which allowed Boris an 80-seat majority. They've no real hope, I feel, of changing that or coming round to challenging. I think one of the problems is Keir Starmer is trying to outdo Boris being Boris at times, and he's not chiming with the people of England who are still on the populist tone of Brexit. And as long as Boris can keep the Brexit drum beating and Lord Frost identifying an enemy over the channel, that'll focus the bread and circuses of the English electorate just fine for Boris's purposes. They might have rising food banks, but you know, it's not Johnny Foreigner's food banks. It'll be the sort of way it'll be spun to them, and they'll swallow it.
And how about your Celtic cousins, your colleagues in Plaid Cymru? They went into the Welsh elections with high hopes, but they made modest progress, but they were pretty well dashed in the face of a surprise Labour victory.
Well, I think it was said by Liz Saville-Roberts and said by Liz Saville-Roberts best when Labour claimed they were stealing the nationalist clothes of Plaid Cymru. They'd planted their tanks on the lawn of Plaid Cymru, and Liz Saville-Roberts pointed out, but yes, Plaid Cymru had made the lawn. So the mood music and the tone of Wales is now being set by the Party of Independence of Wales, and there's an increasing confidence and realisation in Wales. Wales 100 years ago was quite a prosperous state. It had fossil fuels. But you know, look forward 100 years, where Ireland, which was the worst of the United Kingdom's nations, is now about the best. In fact, it is the best.
Worst
with
in
independence.
Economic terms.
Worst in economic terms, absolutely. It's now the best. Now Wales is the worst. Now I think many people in Wales are realising Ireland hasn't leapfrogged them by some miracle. Ireland has come to where it is because it's got independence, and they need to have proper powers themselves.
Finally and briefly, looking at the four nations as a whole, I mean, do you see any unexpected political trends? Are you expecting an immediate constitutional clash between Scotland and England? What's going to happen over the next year or so?
Well, I think if the Scottish Government goes through the inevitable pantomime that is asking Boris Johnson for the Section 30 and that's refused, and that will give people in Scotland a bit of push and momentum about independence. They've got to get on and legislate. That will probably be blocked. And once that's done, Scotland will be indignant and it's going to become independent sooner or later. The process is going to happen.
Of course, the question was, Is it sooner or later, Angus MacNeil?
It's sooner or later.
Angus Brendan MacNeil, the Member of Parliament for Hill and Year, thank you so much for joining me again on the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you.
Our guest detected in the election results a pattern, with the incumbent government being rewarded for the handling of the COVID pandemic. This may not be entirely rational, given that with the exception of the competent vaccination programme across all countries, most observers and certainly statistics would indicate that across Scotland, Wales and England, handling of the pandemic was similar and indeed below average in international terms. However, irrational motives are perfectly legitimate ones for the public to decide to return governments to power. The results, however, are still of importance. The scale of Labour's defeat in England will disabuse any notion that a return to respectability under Sir Keir Starmer's leadership will, in and of itself, be anything like enough to restore Labour's fortunes. Labour looks destined for a radical shake-up or much factional bloodletting, or both. However, the success in Wales does provide Labour with evidence that it is not in inevitable decline in the post-Brexit age of identity politics. More of that next week. In Scotland, with a record poll for the Parliament and a decisive independence majority between the SNP and the Green Party, the results should point to a major constitutional showdown with Westminster sooner rather than later. However, Angus MacNeil is by no means confident that any such move from Scotland will be early, decisive or even forthcoming. And so the end result of these dramatically varying election results may be to leave things very much as they were before the elections. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. But for now, from Alex, myself and all at the show, it's goodbye, stay safe, and we'll see you all again next week.